So of what's on the agenda for today, we finished that Chatterbox application. There's a few things I want to do with the sports store. We're not going to get through all of those things today, that's for sure. So I'll get through, try to get through a few of these things, try to hit the high points as far as that's concerned. And then you guys will have lab time all tomorrow because I'll be out. And then we'll see where we land on Monday. Depending on what all we get done today will influence whether or not Monday is strictly a lab day or a combination of going over some of the other things. But there's just a few more examples I'd like to go through with different web services and different things that we can do with there. All right, so if you haven't yet, please bring that sports store application up. Okay. So the first thing I want to do, so when we've got the admin interface, right, where you can edit, create products, right? Well, ideally, we don't want you to be able to enter two products with the same name. Does that make sense? That'd be kind of a problem. So we want to prevent the user from doing that. Okay. So the first step to that process, under the project, I'm going to go to the database project. I'm going to look at the products table. Okay. So in here, ideally, I want to be able to put in some sort of constraint to say that name has to be unique. Okay, you can't reuse that name. So the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to add at the end of this table definition for the products table, I'm going to add what we call a unique constraint. And this is going to say there. And that's it. So that's the one line I'm going to add to there. So a unique constraint says that this group of columns cannot be duplicated within the table. You'll notice there's parentheses here. That's because I can actually have this be more than one column. So sometimes I may specify more than one column there. That says then that grouping of columns, the grouping of values has to be unique. But for this simple case, I'm just saying, hey, the name has to be unique. If you're only making one column unique, it is possible to write it in line. But I would make a practice of keeping that separate, of keeping it down there. Because that will allow you to do a lot more things that you can't do if you simply put it up there with the name of the column. Okay, so we made that change to the database. I'm going to go push it. Generate script. Okay, let's run that script. Oh. Photo ID is being dropped. Okay, I know that. Okay, so I made that change to the database. What I want to now do is I'm going to go to the actual application. Okay, so it was on the products table. We had a unique constraint. I'm going to go to the admin page. And remember, we're going to access that as /admin. Okay. So, for instance, I've got kayak here, right? I shouldn't be able to enter a second kayak. So I'm going to try and do that right now, and let's see what happens now that I've put that unique constraint in there. So I'm going to call it exactly kayak. I'm going to fill in some dummy data for the rest. And hit save. Oh. Okay. So if I leave this as is, you can see that what the error I'm getting. So it's saying violation of unique key constraint. You'll notice here that there's a random sequence of letters there. Okay, you see that? So it's saying I can't add that row because there's a duplicate value here. Kayak's already in there. Okay, this is a little bit of a not so friendly message, and you'll notice that again this is a name that's showing up. Well, when I created that unique constraint, whenever I create a constraint or an index, that gets a name. If I don't specify one, it will automatically come up with one. And that's usually not what I want. So one thing I can do is I can change what that name is. And let me do that real quick. So if I say constraint, I can now give it a name. And the way I generally name these, you start with IX for index. Then you include the name of the table, and finally the name of the column. So I would call this IX products name.
What is that doing?
So that's naming that unique constraint. That's giving it a name. Okay. Now if I publish that again, so you'll see what it's doing. It says alter table products, drop the constraint by that name, add a constraint by the name I just specified. You see that? IX products name. So I'm going to hit execute on that. I'm going to drop the constraint and recreate it. Okay. Now, if I try to refresh this, you'll see that now it at least says that. Okay. Still not better, but that's a general good rule of thumb. Anytime you have those constraints, you generally want to give them a name, because those random names are just gobbledygook.
So that's just so you can track what the errors come
Yeah, that makes it a little bit easier to track what's actually going on. But either way, this is not the page that we want to show to users, right? If they type in kayak and this comes up, that's going to be very unfriendly to them. Because everybody see that? This is they're not going to know what to do with this. They think your software just isn't working. Okay. So how can we solve this so that the user gets something much more friendly? Evan.
Maybe on the post, when you're actually posting, have an Ajax post method with the callback.fail do something.
Okay, so I do want to do something with Ajax eventually. But first what I want to do is fix it still with the post. I want to actually put both of those things in place so that if for some reason JavaScript's out offline, not set up, not working, or disabled, it can still show the user a friendly message, right? So yes, looking at the post here, so when you edit it, it goes here. What I can do is I could put in another check in here. So I'm going to break this out because I kind of need to do it between here and there. So I'm going to say, go look for a product with that same name. And this shouldn't be too different from what we've seen so far, because you've already seen, go to Edit, Advanced. You've already seen, actually let me change something here. Tools Options, I want to get my tabbing back to, to 2 spaces. There we go. Okay, I'm back to my previous way of doing things. Okay. What am I getting here?
Oh, you just don't have it async?
Oh, no, I have async.
No, first you're
Oh, yeah, that's what's up. Okay, so this we've kind of seen before. It's the same thing that's happening up here, where I say go grab the product with the same ID. So up here, when I start the edit, I'm comparing it on IDs. Here I'm saying, okay, well, let's go find the product with the same name. Okay, so if there is a product with the same name, I know that what you're giving me is not going to work, is going to be a duplicate, right? So I can show you an error message. If not, then we're all good. So what I'm going to say is if duplicate product, if that's not null, if there is a product with that name, then I want to say, well, let's show the user an error. So I might say model state I want to tell it which field to put the error on, so that's going to be the name. And I can do just as such. In fact, I may actually want to take this whole thing and move it before. So that I can just reuse that code. And especially then, you'll still get the error even if you don't fill everything out. So if there is a product with that name that you specified, we're going to go say, oh, name's already in use. And that's going to then trigger this. That is not valid. We're going to show the page again. Does that make sense? So that gives us a good way to say, hey, hold up, hold your horses. That name's already in use. I do need to put both the unique constraint as well as this check in, simply for the reason that this is okay and it'll catch it as far as one user using the system. But if I have more than one user using the system, that unique constraint is still important, because this by itself could still fail if 2 users are trying to enter a product with the same name. Does that make sense? Do something real quick over here. Okay. So let's run this, see what we get right now. Okay. So again, I'm going to try and create a product named Kayak. And you can see there's that error that I gave it. Name is already in use. Okay. So that works. I would definitely recommend anytime you have a unique constraint like that, do a check, make a more user-friendly error like that, rather than having the error page, because that's going to be a lot more user-friendly than that error page. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, one thing I do want to do here, and this is where the Ajax comes in. Okay, where the Ajax comes in. I still want it to be able to tell me that there's a problem as soon as I tab out of it, as I'm typing it in there, right? Right now, as it is, I have to actually submit the form to see that error. Does that make sense? So that's fine, and that's useful, and I still need that, but I want to be able to show that error to the user sooner. Okay, does that make sense? So in order for me to know if that name is in use, what do I need to be able to send to the server?
Just the name.
And be able to send the name to the server, okay? And that would tell me if it's not in use. Well, before we go too far, because I just remembered there's one little thing I have to fix. So if I go edit an existing one and hit save, note that it's always going to give me this error message. It's fine if I'm creating something, but it's going to give me this error message if I go try to edit one that's already out there. Okay. So the thing I need to do about that, recognize, so when I'm looking for a product, I'm looking for a product with the same name. Well, what product has the same name as Kayak? The one I'm just trying to edit, right? So if I don't change the name, I'm always going to get an error in this format. So I need to say I need to modify this where clause to say, okay, the name is the same, but the ID is different. So if I say x dot product ID does not equal to product dot product ID. So that will fix my edits. Right? Yep.
Oh wait, if you're creating a product, ID is set to 0, right?
Yes, and there shouldn't be any products in the database with an ID of 0. Does that make sense? So I'm checking that there's a product with the same name and a different ID. So that'll cover my basis to make sure that the edits still work. And the reason I wanted to bring that up real quick, that means that I need to be able to send to the server potentially not just the name, but also the ID, right? Potentially I need to send both. Okay. Now, there is another way I can work around with that, where I can just send the name, but then I will need to do a little bit more on the client side. So there's a few different ways to implement this check. The way I'm going to go about it is something that might seem a little bit, maybe a little bit much, a little bit harder than what you might be thinking. But the reason I'm going to do it this way is it's going to give me a system that's much more flexible, that I can use to do a lot more than just checking that the name is unique. So if I say action result, get product,
So this is to accomplish that same thing though?
yes, the whole goal here is to show the user early that the name's already in use. Okay. So
Should the G be capital?
1 second. So you said, shouldn't the G be capital?
When you get product.
Oh, yeah, sure. Get product by name. So I want to say, give me the product with that same name. And then I'm going to, actually, I just call this product. Return JSON and product. I'm going to make that only accessible via post. So the upside of returning the entire product is that I can end up doing the rest on the, I can do, as long as I have that, then I can get all the information about the product, and then I can actually deal with that on the client side. Does that make sense? The rest I can do from the client side. So if I know that there's a product with the same name, this is returning the ID. I have the ID on the client side already, so I can deal with that. But this gives me a lot more functionality than just having it hard-coded and the server knows how to like do that check. I'm just saying, hey, give me the product with that name. Now, it's possible that I may only want to return part of that information because there's potentially a lot of information on the product object. So for my purposes here, if I switch it up to use a select, I can tell it what data I actually need to return. So I know I need the product ID, I know I need the name, and that in this case is really all I need. Is the ID of the product and the name of the product. That saves on the amount of data that I have to get from the database, as well as it's saving on the amount of data that I send back to the browser. Does that make sense? So that optimizes that a little bit. Okay, so if I go run that now, or sorry, if we have that in place, I can now call that from the actual view. So if I go back to the admin, back to the admin edit page, we know that first and foremost I'm going to have to add some JavaScript in here to accomplish this. So I'm going to add a section for scripts. Okay. So just by a show of hands, who remembers what's the other thing I have to do? There's something else I have to do with this. Otherwise, I'm going to get an error. What's the other thing?
Me?
Yeah.
You have to go to your layout page and render section scripts.
Okay. Let's see what happens if I don't. Let me show you real quick what happens if you don't. I think some of this, you saw this yesterday. But if you don't set that up, you're going to see an error like this. It says, following sections have been defined in your view, but don't exist in your layout, right? So, and it's also actually telling me I'm using the admin layout, so that's where I need to remember to go add it. I probably want to go ahead and add it in the regular layout as well while we're thinking about it, because I'm actually going to need it in both. So in the regular layout, I'm going to add render section, and render the script section. Make sure you do include the S at the end of that. So render section scripts, and I'm going to do the same thing on the admin layout. So both the regular layout as well as the admin layout have that section in it. Okay. So as far as our scripts go, okay, what's the first thing I need to do here? I want to respond to some sort of event as far as you editing that field, right? So where do I need to start? What's step one? I want to do something when you edit that field.
Create the method.
Okay. Create what method?
A method for whatever you want to do on that page.
Evan?
An event handler?
Event handler. Okay. Yes, I do. How do I set up that event handler?
You grab the input field that is the host of that event.
Okay.
Using like a selector for 90 or something.
Okay. So that's good, and that's right. Somebody else tell me how to write that code.
$sign parentheses,
Okay.
and then inside, whether it's an ID or a class,
Okay.
hashtag or dot.
All right, so somebody tell me what that ID is. Somebody else. What is that ID? What's the ID for the product name?
Name.
How do you know?
I just did an inspect element.
What's the other way you could find it? I go up here and look, right? So this arrow, if I have that in the helper, it's going to be this. It's going to be that part right there, name. That's going to be the ID in the name. So if I say $.name, what event do I want to listen for? Okay, there's more than one right answer here, so I want to see a few hands as far as tell me what event I could listen for.
Key up.
Okay, so key up is one option. Yeah.
Like a click.
A click? Okay, so key up, click.
Focus, maybe?
Focus. Is there another option? What other events can I listen to as far as HTML is concerned?
Isn't there .blur for when it loses focus?
That'd be a good one. Okay, so let me write these up because there's a few of these. Key up. We'll click. Who's the other one? Focus. Blur. Okay. What else? I've got at least two more options.
Would change work?
Change would work. Okay. Okay. Yep.
Mouse out.
Mouse out. So notice I have key up here. Could I also respond to key down? Okay, so these are some options there. Okay, so let's start from the top. Brandon, why might you choose mouse out? What would be the upsides and downsides of doing mouse out?
The user uses the mouse to select the next field.
Is what?
If the user uses the mouse to select the next field.
Okay, well what if I'm using the keyboard? Okay, so that assumes that I'm moving the mouse and the mouse is leaving the field. So first of all, in order for that to work, I have to first of all assume that I moved the mouse onto the field in the first place, right? Because I could have tabbed to the field, or it could have just started there. So that's not a good option because there's a good chance that I'm using the keyboard, and none of the mouse events will work if I'm using the keyboard. Okay. So if I'm entirely going through the keyboard, mouse out, any of the mouse options are not a good place to do because they assume that the user is using the mouse. Okay. On a similar note, Dalton, you'd recommended click. Are you? Which control would you be putting click on? Would you be putting click on the name field or another field?
Well, my thought was when I click on like the next field,
Okay.
that it would run that. But
Right.
if we're not using our mouse.
But what's the next field?
Next field is description, but they could click on any field.
Right. So if I'm creating it, that might be the next field I click on. But what if I'm going into a product and I want to edit the name and the price?
You won't ever run it.
I won't even click on the description, right? So my code will never run, okay? So I don't know what the next field is for sure, so I have to put the click handler on every field in order for that to work. And again, it doesn't work with keyboard, okay? So if let's say I put it on the click for the name, well, it's only going to respond when I start editing, not when I finish making the change, right? So that's not a good thing, okay? So that knocks out that. So I definitely don't want to do anything that revolves around the mouse because that relies on that. Now, what about the keyboard? These two, key down, key up. If I'm changing the name of a product, do I have to use the keyboard?
Yes.
Generally, yes. Generally, yes. And usually, even if you're using a soft keyboard, right, that will usually come in as a key up and key down. So these are both valid options, right? These are both valid options. Yep.
I was thinking key down is when the user presses down on a key, right?
Yep.
So would that send the request before or after it gets adjusts the value in the text
That's a
box?
good question. Yeah. That's a good question. And that, I think, depends. But I think that, I can't remember for sure what the right answer for that one is. I think that you can set it up so that it sends it after it's been entered. But you can also either. It depends on how you get the value that's in the field.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Both of those are valid options. One thing to realize though with these, let's say I erase the whole name and then write in a 20-character name. How many, if I'm responding and sending a request to the server, for every one of these events, how many of the times will I run to the server?
Over 20.
Huh?
Over 20.
Over 20. More exactly?
I can't remember how many you were entering back in.
All depends. So let's say I start with the name, I erase it, and then I type in 20 characters.
Well, erasing it, you're going to press backspace at least once.
Right, so the number of characters were already in there plus 20.
Right.
Right, so if it's already was 10 characters in there, I'm going to send 30 requests to the server.
I mean, if you highlighted it, and you could do it with one.
Okay, right. I could, so I could reduce that, which means I'm only changing it 21 times.
Yeah.
You got a hand up?
We're having this debate. He's saying that focus is the best option.
No,
or
I'm
he's saying blur is the
blur
best
is the
option.
best
But
Okay.
I think key up. Yeah, you have those server requests, right?
So
but
the upside of this,
you get like the automatic feedback.
right. So the upside of this is I get feedback quickly,
Yeah.
right? So on the pro side is quick feedback. On the downside, it's a lot of server traffic. Okay? Pro and con. The good news is this con can actually be eliminated with some clever trickery. Okay, and I'll show you how to do that. But that con can actually be eliminated. So these are actually the way I would go. Let's look at the others. So focus. This is a similar problem to click, where if I'm listening for focus, well, what am I listening to focus on? I can listen to the next field. I don't know which one the next field is. If I'm listening to focus on the field itself, well, that's before I've made the change. So that one's just off the grid for sure. These are actually the same. These blur and change are actually going to work out to be the same. Because the change event doesn't actually trigger until I leave the field. Okay? So the upside of both of these is we only get one change. That's it. We don't have to worry. That's going to be the minimum possible server traffic because we're only going to get it when you leave the field. Yep.
So wouldn't change be a bit better? Because if they don't change the field, then it doesn't act, then it won't activate the event.
Correct, in theory, yes. Yeah. So if I don't make a change to the field, in theory it's that. So my best options are really going to be key up or change, right? So change is going to activate if I enter it and then leave the field, right? The problem is that leaving the field, which means that I don't get quick feedback. It may be quick enough. So there are a lot of websites that are built around this change event. That's still a great option, okay? Simply because it's got the low server traffic and it kind of behaves predictably on all different browsers, okay? So I want to implement it this way first, and then I'm going to change it over here to use QF. I'll show you how I'm going to fix that problem so that it doesn't send as many requests. Okay, so let's start with change.
You're not a big arrow function guy?
Arrow functions are great. Recognize that they don't work on all browsers.
Okay.
So some, especially all the really recent browsers, arrow functions work great. If you want to run this at all on IE, forget using arrow functions, because arrow functions do not work on Internet Explorer at all. They do work on Edge, but they don't work on Internet Explorer. The other reason I'm going to stick with functions for the most part is because that's what people learned in their first semester. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So our current textbooks for Java doesn't cover arrow functions, which is why I'm going to stick with regular functions for now.
Okay.
In this case, the syntax difference is not that big.
Right.
It's not worth really getting into it. So I'm going to write a function this way, and I'm going to say, okay, when it changes, I want to then post to the server. I want to send that value. Okay. So the first thing I need to have in there is I need to get the value that's in that field. So I'm going to say const. Actually, I can just do this as shorthand. Name is equal to $sign this.
Okay, I was thinking just this.
Mm-hmm. Dot val. So I could put hashtag name there. This works because I'm doing the change event on the actual control that changed. So I can do that. And then I want to also have the ID handy. And the way I'm going to get that, I'm going to pull that in from the model. So const product ID is equal to @model dot product ID. Because to do this comparison, remember, if I'm editing, I also need to know the ID. Okay. The upside of that, though, is that product ID doesn't change. The user doesn't have any way to change that. So I can just set that initially here. Okay. So I'm going to say, given that, $sign.post, we want to send to the server. And I'm going to say @URL.action. Get the product by name. Now, in this particular case, should I pass the name as route values, or should I pass it as JavaScript?
As JavaScript.
Yes, why?
Because the product ID is currently saved as a JavaScript variable, and although you can save C# data into JavaScript, you can't do it the other way around. So
Well, what I need to send, you're close. What I need to send to the server, though, is the name,
yeah.
right? What I need to send to the server is the name, which is what the users typed into the box. And that has changed since we rendered the page, right?
Yeah.
So if I sent it as route values, I wouldn't know the current value that was typed into the text box. The point is that value has changed after we rendered the page. Okay, so this is XHR. Excuse me. Okay. Ooh, all right. Okay. So if something goes wrong, actually, I'm just going to log that to the console. Console.error. So log it to the console if it failed. If it did succeed, so what I should have here is an actual product object, right? So if it did come back with something, then I can say, okay, I've got it. So I can say if data, if there is data, and data.name is equal to name, and data.product ID okay. Sorry, and then the product ID is different. So if I did get a row, it's the same name and it's a different ID, then I need to know, then I know that I need to show an error to the user. Okay. Otherwise, it's all good. Otherwise, the name that they entered is valid. Okay. So if in the case that I get a product, in case that I get one back, I want to show it there. Let me run it real quick so I can get the IDs. Actually, here. So let's see, what's the ID of this validation? So it doesn't have an ID that I can reference to. So I need to give it one. You can see that? So this error message here does not have an ID. So I need to give it one. So I'm going to go over to here. So ID is equal to name error. That way I'll be able to reference it in code. I could use a sibling, or I could say, hey, give me the next sibling. The problem with that is it assumes that the HTML that I have has a certain structure. So if I wanted to change that in the future, that would be a problem. So it's just better to give it an ID rather than relying on where it is in the HTML. So I'm going to set that as name error. And in here we're going to say $, So have name error. So in that case, I want to set it actually to the same error I had up here, which was that one. So in the case that the name's already in use, I'm going to specify the error as that. Now, I do have a little bit of a problem here because, well, what happens if I leave the blank? What happens if I leave the name blank?
Doesn't say that name is already used.
It's, if you leave the name blank. Yeah, doesn't it use, for querying strings, doesn't it use equal dot like?
Huh?
Doesn't it use dot like?
It only uses likes if I do contains. Remember, so I'm doing an equals. So it's going to say, is it exactly equal? Well, if the case of I leave it empty, well, there should be no product in there with an empty string, right? So assuming there's no product in there with an empty string, I'm going to get back null, which means I'm going to get back here, which means it's never going to tell the user that you need to enter a name. Does that make sense? So how can I go about that so that I still show that message to the user if they leave the field blank? What can I do? Yep.
You can put all of that in an if, so that when it checks the change, it checks if there's anything in it.
What do you mean all of that?
From
Give me line numbers.
second to last colon to const.
Okay, Jeremy, what you're gonna say?
I don't know if it's this simple, but can you just put the HTML as the former error message that it was, or that it generally is?
Okay.
Go back to that.
So where would I find the former message?
The models?
Okay, so let's look at the model. And you guys are both kind of on the right track, but you're talking about different things. Okay. So here I said, please enter a product name. So that's my error message. Yes. I probably want to set it back to, probably want to have it be that if it's empty. Okay. So you were suggesting that I should put it maybe all around the post and don't do the post. Okay. I could wrap an if around that. I could also just do it like so. So if there's not a name, then return. Just leave the function, don't do anything if there's no name. So does that make sense? This is actually the same as what you had suggested, Alex?
What I would have suggested would do an else if there isn't, if the name is left empty.
Okay.
So,
But you can see how this is
yeah.
less lines of code, right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to get to.
Would
Is-
that,
Yep.
that's the way I was thinking too. Would that have worked?
What do you mean?
Just like if we did it in an if else.
Okay.
If name isn't an empty string,
Okay.
then run this. Else
Right.
or-
So effectively, that's what I'm doing, right? This is just effectively shorter. So if I were to say instead, if name, right? Put the curly brace then after all that, right? That would work.
There's no need because
Right. And command.
But doing it this way, that keeps it short. Now, That's one thing. There's different opinions on whether or not you should have more than one return statement within a function. My general feeling is the easier it is to read, the better. Which I feel like that makes it easier to see what's going on. I just say, hey, if the name's not valid, skip all the rest of the function. Does that make sense? So let's try that. Let's see if there's any problems with that. Okay. So I'm editing this kayak right now. If I erase it like that, it still says, please enter a product name. If I say kayak, I'm all good. If I type in human chess board, notice I don't have an error yet. You see that? And remember, that's because I'm responding to the change event. Okay, so it does that check when I tab out. Also notice that on that front, it may or may not update it immediately as I'm typing. What happened here?
Since you didn't change the code, it's not actually running or change the...
Right, I didn't actually change it. So I had the error, right? So let me get back to the error. So I tabbed out of it, okay? So watch the sequence of events. So I go in here, I change it, right? That cleared out the message. If I tab out of this, you would expect to see that message again, right? So it's recording the change from when you tabbed in to when you tabbed out.
So if you were to use blur there instead of change?
Yes, that would fix that problem. So if I were to go back and say blur, right, so that's where on change has got a lot of tricky areas where it seems kind of like the obvious solution, but it's not always the right solution. So that will trigger any time I leave the field whether or not I've actually made a change. And that's only needed simply because we still have obtrusive validation in here. If I didn't have obtrusive validation turned on change would be fine. Does that make sense? But as you can see, it's responding to the click event. It's responding to the mouse down or mouse up event. Okay. All right, so real quickly, let's just see what happens if I change this to Kiev. Okay. There's an interesting thing. Why is my error message not going away?
Do we need to clear the HTML there? Like every time the key up at the beginning of the event? Right.
What do you mean? So let's try this. I'm going to go open F12. I'm going to get in the sources. Let's look at the JavaScript and put a breakpoint in there. So let me put a breakpoint here on line 83.
Well, it looks like there's a syntax error.
I was getting that yesterday.
Oh, okay. So sorry. And then let me just make that console log. Okay, so I've got a breakpoint on line 83. Well, that's interesting. Why did it only go to here right at that moment? So let's look at our console. So it looks like if I don't type something in, you can see that I'm getting this parser error in the console if it doesn't match exactly. So for whatever case, it's giving me, I'm getting into this error whenever it doesn't match. Okay, you see that? So if there isn't a product by that name, I'm getting some sort of parser error. That's interesting. So I'm getting the value here as human chessboard, and I'm trying to send it to the server, but it's giving me, I'm ending up with some sort of error. You see that? So something's not quite right. If I look at the network, let's see what's happening as far as what we're sending to the server and what we're getting back. So I'm posting to get product by name. I'm posting this just boa. There's no response coming back. See that? There's no response coming back.
What was the name of the action?
Well, the name of the action's right. Name of the action's right. So for whatever case I'm seeing, it's giving me back. It's not giving me back a null like I would expect that. Does that make sense? I would expect it to give me back a null if there's no product. Okay. So let's check that. If I run a breakpoint here, let's check that web service. Here's the name, H, product is null. That's not being serialized correctly back to JSON. Which means I'm ending up getting a fail because it can't parse that. Because what it's sending back is, rather than sending back a null, the word null, it's sending back empty string. Which is not what the JavaScript side is expecting. Does that make sense? So because of that, I'm getting a failure. Okay. So any ideas how we can work around that?
Instead of if product is empty, instead of returning a JSON, it just returns null.
Okay. What do you mean?
Just if product does not equal null, then return JSON product, else return null.
But we don't know if to return null until we make that request.
Well, assuming, no, we're assuming this is already run, right? Assuming we know the product is null or not, right?
Well, what is actually being returned? What is JavaScript actually reading?
So what's JavaScript is seeing, and that's what I was looking at in the network tab here, is what I can see is actually what's coming back is just empty. There's nothing coming back as a response. And because when it tries to parse the JSON, it would need to parse it as the word null. That makes sense? N-U-L-L. And then it would parse it successfully, which is why we're seeing that parser error when it comes back and it's not, when it should be null. Because in that process, it's trying to parse it as something. Okay. Well, let's try one thing real quick. I know that here, I know that there's another option I can give to post. And specifically, I know that I can tell it a data type. So what happens, and I don't know if this will fix it or not, what happens if I just tell it to parse the return as JSON? Because at the moment, it's trying to have to figure out what type it is. Okay. Save that. Try this again. Oh, I need to run here. Okay. Let me hit continue. I'm still getting the same thing. Okay, so that didn't solve it. So what if I say if the product is not null, I return the product, otherwise I return empty string. I just need to force it to be an object. What happens if I do that? Is it going to send it back as something else? Let me check relative. MVC return JSON. Oh, okay, so there's the interesting thing. So jQuery 1.8, this worked. 1.9 is where so jQuery changed, and it's no longer parsing that correctly. So, okay. So let's try that. So maybe if the product product is not equal null. Yeah, there we go. I think that might just work.
Could you have done that with a ternary?
I might have been able to do that with a ternary. I'm not 100% sure on that front. And try it. Yeah, that worked. So sending back false. Yeah. Yeah, so there's what it's sending it back as. That's fine. Well, let's see. Could I do that as a ternary? If I say product is not as null, okay. The error I'm getting here is because if I'm doing a ternary, both of those sides have to return the same data type. So I've got product : false. So it could be a product object or it could be false. If I force that to be object, yeah, that does make it happy. Because like, okay, I can turn false into an object and return that. So that's a workaround. Okay. So sources. Let's see. So I'm going to start with kayak and type in human chessboard. There we go. So that's working. So that was just down to, hey, something changed in jQuery since we last did that.
Would now be a good time for a break?
Now would be a good time for a break. Come back at 2. And the thing I want to do when we come back from break is look at how to make that not send a request every time the user presses a key. So Dalton, you had a hand up briefly though?
Yeah, mine's not working.
Okay, I'll come take a look.
Should I do that on Great as well?
Yeah, she was doing that with Greg as well. So make sure you hit execute because you've got to change the server side. Try with an uppercase K. There it is.
Should we look at
Hash name.
hash?
IDA. So none of your JavaScript is working. And it's important where you have this jack here to be outside of that event. But then that's because otherwise it won't actually. Great. That's still inside the object you're sending. get the JavaScript debugger. So sources, this. So in theory, we should be able to put a breakpoint on line 109.
It's right here.
The name, this needs to be uppercase. and that needs to be lowercase.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, because that's coming back from the C# world. No, not that one, because that one's from the Java one. So that's your name, and this one's also that property from
So
the C#
this is
world.
saying like that models.
And that needs to be product.
Okay.
So those two need to be exactly what's in the model. The other
That's in a
ones
blur.
are-
What is this one?
It's uppercase key as well.
How can we use blur instead of blue?
Case is really important.
So,
Just close that, go back there. So just general role of things. You don't need to bring it down everything. All you need to do is
Go back to what was.
try keeping the same capitalization. Let's just see if it. So this is JavaScript. So here we're at. So there, as we would expect. Let's step over. So 117. So we got in here, and we got data is this object here, product ID 1 and 5. Okay. Oh, this is equals. This needs to be not equals. That's your problem. Yeah, it needs to be equals to the name, but a different product ID. Details. Yeah, just really quick one. Ajax Post.
He doesn't want to listen.
Okay, so then we may need to fix that.
Hit escape.
Tab. So that looks like the unobtrusive validation statement at that point.
Let's see if they get the same thing. Silly pump.
Oh, yeah. Same thing for me. It goes away if I tab out of it. So that would mean that the unobtrusive validation is listing to both key up and the blur. Yeah, so we're going to have to just pull this out as a separate function.
Mr. Smith, can I move my car from
Yeah.
being outside campus?
Yeah.
We got lines all over the Marion thing. I have parked in the field and things in the buildings.
Oh, that's, yeah. Parked on the side, so I'm not doing that. That's a hassle. You get blocked in so easily over there.
Yeah, I'm hoping I'm not gonna go out there.
Yeah, that'd be
I wouldn't
terrible.
think this time. This will be like afternoon. There wasn't very many people out there when we got there. But where I parked, definitely blocked in. Mr. Smith?
Yep.
Is there any way you could, I'm trying to get caught up.
Yeah.
So, I have all of that on the edit page.
Mhm.
Else did you have? Go back to the controller. The admin controller. As we were starting, I realized I didn't have the controller up to date, and so.
Okay, I don't know what you had to change, but okay.
I haven't changed anything. Or I added, that little bit at the top.
What
You
what
just
bit
did
at the
today.
top?
Yeah.
They didn't do it at the top.
At the top, right here.
Where?
Okay, good.
Okay, that's not where I did it. Oh, wait, so that's, okay. Right, yeah, so we did that, but that's not the big thing that we did. That was this is as far as taking care of it, that's as far as if we wanna take care of it without Ajax.
Okay.
So that was the first thing we did, but you're quite a bit behind then, if that's all you have.
Yeah, I got that up there, but that's that and that. For new, get it.
We need a new method here. This is the web service that we built. Action result. Get. So yeah, you have that, you see I'm following this here, right? You're missing that whole method. Let's say get it by name. So our product, right? Great. The products. I did a dot select, so I only get part of the data. Kind of like, remember in SQL you may only want some of the columns to come back. So I said grab just the product ID and the name. That's good. And then I said I wanted the one where the name is the same. Does that make sense? So take a name, go give me a product with that name, and then return it. And the issue that we just ran into is that it's not returning null correctly. So in order to fix that, I said check if it's null. Yeah. So otherwise it returns false, which then the false will be treated correctly. And in order to force that to be happy, tell it that X that as an object. So effectively return the product, otherwise return false. So then that comes back here, and we check here, and this part will fail, because we're saying give me that. So if it's false, then that one will fail.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense? Now, the place you have this is completely wrong. Because where you're checking it before the changes happen, right? So if you do that, it's absolutely not gonna work, because you're not getting the name at the right time. Right, so you would, both of those you'd like to go into the change handler. I have them underneath the change, underneath key up. That's where I'm getting the name. So these two lines of code that we got here,
Oh, I see.
they're in the wrong place.
Right.
I'm just. Okay.
You just put it inside there.
Yeah. Okay. Does that make sense? So then it'll grab the name at the time that this event occurs, rather than grabbing it when the page loads.
I see.
Okay.
Yeah, I just forgot.
Sorry. At least I'm recording.
Right. I was either, that's where I was gonna do, is either watch the recording and
But
try to get caught up
it's
on the-
preferable not to like too much to that, because otherwise you're like lost. Okay, so two problems that we did see kind of on the break, and I want to correct real quick. So if I look at where this is right now, two things I'm seeing. So if I do the keep up event, it's fine. If I now tab out of it, the error goes away, which means that I'm going to need to handle the blur event as well. I'm going to need to handle both the key up and the blur event with the same handler. The other thing I am seeing, if I say, go back here to add new product. So if I type in kayak, all uppercase, we're good. If I type in kayak lowercase, they're not so good. Does that make sense?
So it needs to be case insensitive.
Needs to be case insensitive. Well, the good news is it's already case insensitive on the server. So if I just remove this part here, that middle bit, and don't try to compare the name again, that's fine. If I don't do the name comparison again in the JavaScript, that'll fix that problem, because the comparison that it did on the server was case insensitive.
You just got rid of data.name equal name?
Yeah, I just removed that name comparison in the JavaScript. That'll take care of it.
So why do you not need that data name?
Because the server already did it. Does that make sense? The server is giving me back a product that matches my name.
That's when you pass that name object in the post.
I already passed the name to the server, so the product that it returned, if it returned a product at all, will have the same name. So simply by me checking that it did return a product, which I'm doing here first, I know that if it returned a product, it has the same name. So I don't need to do that check again. If I wanted to do it case insensitively, I could say 2 upper, 2 lower. There's another way to do it, which is more new, which uses the local compare function, but that's a quick fix. Now, if I want to be able to call this in 2 different events, right? I don't want to duplicate the code for sure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually extract that whole function here. I'm going to extract it and give it a name. So I'm going to extract that and say on name change, and maybe I'll give it that name. And then in the key up, I'll just say there. So I've got a function now called onNameChange. I say onKeyUp, call that function. And I can also say dot blur onNameChange. So that way I'm calling that function both on KeyUp as well as when the name changes. I mean, as well as when you leave the field. So effectively, I'm doing both, right? Effectively, I'm doing both of those handles, both of those checks. Questions?
There you go. So take that anonymous function out. There you go.
So, yeah. So previously that function was anonymous, I was just passing it through. Now I'm actually just going to extract it and give it a name. The other thing that helps me to do by extracting it and giving a name, it actually makes it easier for me to handle it and say, well, don't go every time that the text changes, right? So what tools might I be able to use to reduce the number of times that I sent to the server? Any suggestions? Because I really don't need to send it on every single time you change it.
Could you set up a counter of some sort that only sends a request after a certain amount of key ups?
Well, I could, but then what happens if that counter is, say, 3 changes, and I only make 2 changes?
It wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work, no. So that's a definite no. As far as saying every so many changes, do it. So I can't do it based on the number of changes, but I can do it based on something else.
Can you set up a list of names that it's already found?
Nope.
So that
I'm going to do something much simpler. Do something much simpler. So rather than sending it for every change, as far as counting the changes, I want to use time, right? When I actually really want to check that the name is duplicated is when there's a pause in you typing. Does that make sense? I really don't want to make that request until you pause. Okay. So you type in a few characters, and then you sit there for a few milliseconds, say 200 milliseconds. That's when I'll send the request. How might I be able to do that? Remember?
Send interval?
So send interval we talked about yesterday. Send interval is going to say every so many milliseconds do something. But I really want it to be so many milliseconds after you've done something. I only want it to happen once. So remember there's some other methods that are like send interval. What's the other one that's like send interval?
set timeout.
Set timeout, right? So set timeout says do such and such, call this method, call this function so many milliseconds later, right? So what I'm going to say instead, I actually want another function here. Or maybe not. No, I'll make it a function. Function. I'm just going to call it delayed. And what I'm going to do, oh, and here I actually do need to, if I'm going to make this change, I do actually need to change this method to be on that ID. So I'm going to change that to be add name instead of being just this. Because when I move this stuff around, what's going to happen is this isn't going to be what it used to be. That makes sense? So name. So I need to make sure I specify that selector there. Okay. So what I'm going to say is in this method, I'm going to say, first of all, clear the timeout. And then I'm going to set a timeout. So call it 200 milliseconds later. So effectively, when I call this 200 milliseconds after I call this, it's going to call onName change. And if I call this again, it's going to reset that timer and set it another 200 milliseconds forward. Does that make sense? So every time I call it, I cancel that timeout and I set a new one. That's what I'm going to call down here. So on the key up, I'm going to call onName change delayed. Same thing with blur, I'm going to call onName change delayed. So effectively in both of those events, I'm going to say set a timer for 200 milliseconds. At that point, go check if the name is duplicate.
So on that first line, we'll just erase the timeout if it's type again within 200 milliseconds.
You said what?
So the first line basically deletes the timer.
Right.
If it hasn't been anything typed, if something is typed within 200 milliseconds.
Yeah. If I don't clear that timeout, then I would still be sending the same amount of requests to the server. I'd just be sending them all 200 milliseconds after they happened. Does that make sense? If I didn't make that change there. If I don't remove the timeout, then I'll be sending it again and again and again still. Okay. So does that make sense? You can see where that's going to lead to a lot less requests to the server. So in theory, it shouldn't go until I finish typing. The other thing that means is sometimes that work of sending that request can take a bit of, take a little bit of time, and that can be perceived sometimes to the user as like a stutter as you're writing text in. So it kind of stutters like, oh, I typed in a character, it might take a little bit for that character to show up. So by having it wait a little bit before it sends that, it's sending it when the user's not actively typing. So if I type in kayak, it's there. So that still works. Okay. So does that give you a little bit of guidance? So that's as far as making a nice interface for if there's something already there with that same name, because that comes up quite a bit. Or let's say you're signing up for an account on a website, you want to check if that email is already in use. Well, that gives you a good way to check if that email is already in use. It also potentially puts us into, you notice that a lot of this code that we've done, you think that might be able to apply to some sort of autocomplete, maybe? So as you're typing it in, it's giving you suggestions in your search dropdown. So this similar kind of system that we have here, we can use for that as well, to make our searches better. So while this is a common use case for it, it's not, these tools aren't just specifically for that. They're a bit more broad. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and check this in at this point, just to make sure we have it. What was next on my list? So here we are. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do real quickly is to give you some way to preview those photos. Because if we look at the edit or the create at the moment, notice that we can pick it from the drop down, but it won't actually show us the photo here, right? So it won't actually show us a preview of that picture, right? And this part here specifically isn't really necessarily as much an Ajax thing. It's mostly just a JavaScript thing. But it is helpful to kind of see where that would fit in. Okay. So so here we have all the drop downs, right? So underneath each of the drop downs, I'd like to have a place to show the photo. So I'm going to add in an image tag there. What should I put as the source of that image tag? What should I put as the source of that image tag?
I don't think it should have one.
Okay, you don't think it should have one. Well, what if I'm editing a product that already has images on it? So say this one's here, right? I've already picked some images and saved it. Shouldn't I already have some images showing up? So what I might want to do, remember how I get that I've got the images to show up previously. I did url.action, and I said that I wanted to go to what controller? What controller has our images? Is it, yeah, I've got a photo controller. Okay. So, and on the photo controller, I'm looking at get image. Okay, so that's the name of it. Get image takes a photo ID. So I'm going to say get image. Photo. And then for the route values, it's going to be photo ID is equal to model dot photos dot photo ID. Yeah. So that's the initial image that I want to show.
Isn't your route value supposed to be lowercase?
What do you mean?
The photo ID?
It actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter there. I know that in the photo controller it's lowercase, so I could make it lowercase there. It doesn't actually end up being mattered because when you do a mapping from sending data to inputs on the inputs on parameters for action methods, that's actually case insensitive.
Oh, okay.
So that actually doesn't, it's usually good to match it up, but it actually doesn't have to be.
Okay.
Okay, so if you run that, check that out, you should see a preview of the images, like so. So if I go to edit a product, I should see them under here. But one thing I'm going to see, note that if I change it, that preview doesn't change, right? That preview is not changing as far as if I change the actual image. There. Dalton, Evan, you got something to share?
No, my picture is just massive.
Okay.
Compared to all
Right.
the rest of them.
Yeah. So one thing you might want to do, recognize we've just allowed it to be as big as it wants to be. So I might want to say, specify the size of that image, and specifically I might want to specify the height of it, I'm going to say. So I'm going to say maybe the height is 100 pixels, and let's see what that gives us. Yeah, that works about right. So if I set the height, the width is going to be set automatically. Yes, Scott?
I got a parameters dictionary or null entry for parameter product ID.
For parameter product ID,
Product ID.
it should be photo ID. It should be photo ID here.
Yeah. That's what I took note, was not lowercase. I wonder if that was still note. This was just a second ago, capital F.
Did you write any changes?
So the preview? So where is
Doesn't mean that the computer can read your mind.
Oh, your edit, you don't have an ID. Okay, you may have. Just go back to the admin page.
Why do you?
And look at it on the first product. You just don't have that. You just don't have that.
What's the route where we added photos?
So go back and publish your database.
So we get the photos like public?
So that's what we've got. We've got previews. We want it to actually change, right? We want to actually change when you pick something different from the dropdown. So in order to change that, we do definitely need some JavaScript, right? Because we need to have that happen on the browser side. The upside is of it, I don't actually have to do an Ajax call because I just need to change the source. Does that make sense? If I just change the source, the browser will automatically go grab the new file. So as far as that's concerned, if I go down here, this, I do need some classes here. I don't have classes on this stuff yet, or some IDs. So if I have on the drop down, I would need to say something like product photo drop down, and maybe this is class product photo preview. So I need to give both of these a class so I can refer to them. Because remember, if I'm going to do anything with jQuery, I need to have either a class or an ID. The reason I don't want to use an ID is because I have more than one of these. I don't want to have to deal with different, those would be different IDs. So if I give them classes, it's going to make this easier because there's more than one of them. Okay, so I'm going to say when the product photo change, when you pick something different from there, so that'd be dot product photo dropdown. When that changes,
Can you make the text a little bigger?
Yep.
Thank you.
So I do my logic when you pick something different in the dropdown. So specifically, I want to get the ID of the product that you changed, and then go change the image accordingly. Okay. So var photo ID is equal, or const photo ID is equal to $, this. So that would give me the value that you picked. And then I would say if, let's say there, we want to change the photo ID based on that. So the source of that image so product photo preview. Okay. So I'm going to change the source attribute. Actually, just use single quotes all the way here. If I want to change the source attribute, well, what do I need to change it to? What should I change the source of the image to? Any suggestions? What should I change the source of the image to?
New photo ID.
To the what?
Take the new photo ID and how to use it.
So, I mean, should I just set it to like that?
Probably not.
Could you use this dot photo ID?
Huh?
Could you use this dot photo ID?
This photo ID? Well, I've already gotten the ID of the photo. The problem is I need to get a URL.
Would you do the same thing as before? The URL get action, get image?
Okay,
Using
yeah,
the new photo ID?
that's a good start. So let's say URL dot get action, or URL dot action. If I say get image, because I think that's what it was. Yeah, get image photo. Okay. Now what? What do I do with this photo ID?
Well, is get image a get or a post? Just can't we? Oh, never mind.
It accepts get, so it's all fine. If I've got a URL to the image, it has to be get.
Right.
What do I do with the photo ID?
So
Yeah.
check if that photo ID equals.
Well, let's just for a second assume that it's a valid photo ID. What do I want to do with it?
Well, don't you have to? You can't use it as route values because that's a JavaScript thing.
Yeah.
Trying to pass as a C# variable, so do you
Right.
have to use an Ajax get to do that?
No, I won't have to do an Ajax, but I do need this as somehow it needs to end up in the URL,
Right.
right? But I can't do that on the server because I won't know what you have changed it to.
Couldn't you concatenate a string?
I could. Okay, I could. What string?
The source string you could add in photo ID.
Okay, I could what?
You could add in photo ID.
I could add in photo ID, right? So somebody else, what character would I need to type? What characters do I need to type to actually make that happen? Yes, I can do that. I can do concatenation. Recognize on here it wants to be it as photo ID. How does that URL look normally? Let's go look at it. So if I inspect this, let's go look at what the URL is normally. See how it's photo get image question mark photo ID is 17? So I can build that URL myself, right? So I can build that in JavaScript by just ending this with question mark photo ID. Does that make sense? I'm building it up in JavaScript. Actually, I'm missing an equal sign right here. I need to make sure I have that equal sign right there. Okay. Why don't you try that out? Tell me what's wrong in a minute. So once you see what's wrong, raise your hand. And give a few people a chance to find it. You may want to make sure that your before you get in here, make sure that your product has more than one image. Alex, are you still getting work on where you at?
Well, I'm still a bit behind on the videos tutorial, so it's right now this part is relying on components I haven't put in yet.
Okay.
So I don't really have any way to test it.
Okay. Well, it's just not. It's a different problem. Do you have your product photos or preview up?
So go back and look at your classes, make sure you have those classes.
Yeah, I don't think you have that class there. Product photo preview would be it. It's on this image source. You didn't add a class. That's why.
Let's go with your classes. Checking the progress.
Right there.
And those colors exactly.
It wasn't identical. Oh, she was. It destroyed itself. Oh, I know why it's out. Okay, so I think a few people have found the problem. Where are we at? Because all three of them had the same. Okay. I'm mad.
Okay. So if you've tested it already, let me bring this over here. So with the code that I've written there, if I change this image here, notice it's changing all of the images, right? So I've got the right image showing up at least, so I know that much is right. I know the URL that I'm building is correct because I'm getting the right image. But why am I changing all of the images? Brandon, do you have an idea? I'm saying the what?
Setting all of the photo IDs to the same number.
Okay.
I just got a text message from public safety asking me to move my vehicle. I gotta do that.
Go do that.
Because you're targeting the class which all of the images have.
Yes. Evan?
Yeah, I was gonna say we should build a separate ID for each image.
But I don't need to.
Okay.
That would be, I could do that. That would be pretty wasteful because it would take a lot more work to do that.
So, okay.
But yes, the fact is that all of those images have the same class. And here I just told it to change everything with that class to this source, right? So my selector here is not specifically selecting just those, okay? So what I can do is use a little bit of different jQuery work. So if instead I go off of siblings, I can give it a selector. Actually, that's not right because that's giving me all of them. I need that to be, I think, next. Or not. So it's not next because you can see the drop down here and then it's 2 things away. So if I go by that, next, there. Oh, actually, there it is. That's the one I wanted next until, probably. Either way, so if I say next, that will get me down to the specific one that goes with it. Does that make sense? Because it's a drop down, then there's a validation message, and then there's the image. So, again, I could use an ID, but that would be a lot more work.
So this is referring to the function event.
This is referring to
the select
drop
that
down.
started the event.
Right?
And that event is
Yes.
this drop down.
Evan, Essen?
So that's why drop down is the drop down. Once it's like yeah, and that could be this one, that could be that one, that could be that one, which are all the same class. Right?
There's 2 lines.
So then it's getting the product photo ID, just the value of this. That's what I select here.
Okay.
And then setting the new source.
Rather than trying to get it vertically,
Yeah, because
you just pull it down.
well, it's not doing right now. Okay, right now it's just gonna apply the source to whatever you selected.
Remember you have to
Because
unselect that because
you're
otherwise
not doing it to the entire class. Because you do it to the entire class, that's when it.
remember you have to unselect that because it's just running the combo.
When you do this, that next you're doing this. So if you change this one right to like a different image.
Yeah, you've got some stuff missing.
Well, I say that, I'm not sure.
Where though? I don't think.
See? Because it used to refer to the entire product photo preview class. And that is associated with this one, and that one. But now it's just targeting the specific one, but doing that next. Right? Instead of doing the entire class. Does that make sense?
Looking for product photos as it should be. You just call defaulted to single product photo. I was looking for the product.photo.
Product photos. You need an S at the end. You're missing an S at the end. Okay. So that was the images, the image preview thing. That's all we have to do there. And just the point there is, hey, that's something that's helpful to have some sort of preview of the image. But just because you're making a change like this doesn't necessarily mean that you always need to use Ajax. Does that make sense? So there are some things like this where you don't actually need to use Ajax because I'm not trying to necessarily get something from the server. I'm just asking I'm kind of letting the browser go grab that other file. But it uses a lot of the same tools. The last one I think I want to do today, because this one's probably going to connect with what you need to do next the most, is I want to go ahead and build a contact form, a quick contact form into this website. So as far as that goes, where's the best place for me to stick a link in here to contact us? Where do we usually stick it?
At the bottom of the page.
Huh?
At the bottom of the page.
Well, if I stick it at the bottom of the page, you think somebody's going to find it? I mean, you could.
Oh, in the nav bar?
Might stick it in the nav bar. That's one option. I could stick it in the footer. I could stick it in the nav bar. I don't have anything else in the nav bar right now, which should make it kind of maybe a little bit awkward. But I could stick it in the nav bar. Is there any other options as where I put a contact form? Any other creative solutions?
What about your links?
Huh?
What about your links? All photos, space, library?
Well, those are category links, so I don't necessarily want to overload those, if that makes sense. I don't necessarily want to overload those to be something completely different. I mean, I could try to put it over here, but I think probably what I'm going to go with is make sense is to just go ahead and put it in the nav bar after the sports store name. Does that make sense? So I'm going to just add the links in here. Okay. So if I go to the layout, so what I can see in here, we've got the sports store name, which is there, and I can see that I've got the cart summary. I've got something about this menu nav. All right, that's the categories. Okay, so this part's my actual nav bar. So let's stick it in there. So HTML.action link. I might want to point that at the products. So if we remember right, the name of that action is list, the name of that controller is product. I want that to be styled as an action link or a nav link. Nav link. And I want this to be to the contact page. So yeah, we're just on the layout page. So all I'm doing there is adding all I'm doing is adding 2 links there. I do need to remember to put those in an unordered list, it looks like. So UL class nav, put each of these in an li. And class nav dash item. What am I missing? Because those are still showing up as not as I would expect them to. So I've got them nav. Oh, navbar nav. Okay. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so for them to style it properly, they would need to be that way. Although I don't. Where are those showing up vertically? Oh, I made this a flex container, didn't I? Or did we? So those are a flex container, which means that's going like that. So I'm getting it like this, which I'd really expect it to be more horizontal. Okay, so navbar nav is making it a flex and making it a column there. At what point does it become a row?
Doesn't one of them need to be active?
One of the links?
Yeah.
No, it doesn't have to be. I know that it doesn't have to be active. It looks to me like the UL's always being set to a column. Well, maybe I just need to keep this simple. Maybe I just make them buttons for now. So instead of trying to make them nav links, I think I'll just make them buttons, and that's going to make them do what I want better, kind of quicker. BTN, BTN secondary, or secondary, outline secondary. So if I make them buttons, maybe they'll behave a little bit better. you're still being centered, which why is that? So the summary, ideally, let's take a quick look at the summary. So if I go look at cart summary, that view, that div, maybe I just need to make that div bigger. So if I say flex grow 1 on there, yeah, no. That's not going to solve my problem. So leave the cart summary alone. That's not the problem there. Because if I do that, then all of this stuff came over to the left. I actually just want probably just the spacer between those two things. Yeah, that's all I need. So that gets me closer to what I was looking for. Huh? So that's what I've got there. Oh, my links are not right. Where'd it go? Interesting note here. These are showing up as list and index. Right? You see those are showing up as list and index? What did I mess up? What did I miss?
The way you have your bullets set up right now, the first parameter is going to be the name of the text.
Right. Which I was thinking it was going to be the other way around. I was thinking it was going to be the other thing. So it actually needs to be products first, because it was using the first thing as the name of the link rather than the action. So and a little bit of margin would set them apart. So we've got product and card index, contact index is going to get me to that page. Okay.
So you took it, it's not in an unordered list anymore?
I removed that. I was trying to get it to work as a regular nav thing with just little code. Really, it should be in the whole collapse thing. But I didn't want to go through all that right now, so I just made them buttons rather than doing the whole nav link, nav item, etc. That took a little bit more effort than I thought it would, but oh well. Live and learn. Okay, did you get that, Scott?
That
Oh, good.
part, yeah.
Okay. So if we've got the links in the nav bar. I want to actually create the controller. So I'm going to go close all these tabs. Close all my tabs down. Make sure I hit save all. And then I'm going to create this new controller, which is going to be the contact controller. So add controller, contact. Okay. Just to keep this simple, I'm not actually going to put in the code to send the email. I'm just going to put in the code to add it here. So HTTP, just to have it say, hey, it was sent. So obviously I need a get version, I need a post version. Obviously my get version doesn't need to take anything because initially everything's going to be blank. What do I probably want to have as a parameter on my post version of this contact?
Maybe like a message object.
Maybe some sort of message object? More specifically? You got a hand up, Evan?
I feel like you're gonna need more information than just the message object. So it might be extra, but I would probably make a contact view model.
I would, yeah. I would exactly do that. Because of the contact controller, that's what we're trying to do. That's a good place to go. So I'm going to add a class. We're going to call it contact view model. This is under the models folder again. So under the models folder, I'm going to create contact view model. I might want to know who sent it. So public string, full name. I might also want their email address. So public string email. And I want what are they actually sending. So maybe public string message. Okay. Should I put any attributes on here?
Yeah, maybe some required.
Maybe some requireds. What should be required?
Probably all of it.
Yeah, probably all of it's a good rule of thumb here. So I think all of those things I want. And one note, I am doing this on a separate page, but there's no reason that this has to be a separate page. So for instance, if you remember your portfolios, you have your contact form on the same page, that's okay. And this is going to be a lot better when you have the one I want to show you here is going to make a lot more sense when you have it on one page instead of having it on a separate page. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say I should probably put a display attribute on full name.
Yes, I definitely should. So I'm going to say display name is equal to full name. So that shows up that way. Okay. So that gives me a basic model there. Is there anything else that I should put on there, on that model? Do I need any sort of data type attributes?
Yes.
Okay. So which attributes? Which property do I want to put the data type attribute on?
I think there's two, email and message. For email, you need the email data type.
Mm-hmm.
And for message, I don't remember the name, but there's a data type for a string that's supposed to have multiple lines.
Yep. Evan, you had your hand up. Do you know
I
what?
was gonna say the same exact
Do you know what? Do you know what type it is?
no.
You're really close to it, Alex.
Just multi-line text,
Yeah.
I think.
So data type multi-line text. So remember what that's going to do is it's going to kind of tell it that it needs to be a text area instead of a text box. Yep.
So since you added those data types, is that a case where you use editor for instead?
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and use editor for all three of these when I build out the form. So let's go over to the contact controller again. We can say take this contact view model. And I'm just going to call that model.
You called it model view.
Oh, duh. Okay, let me rename that. I'm being a little bit scatterbrained today. So we've got our model. We need to add that view. So I'm going to right click in here and say add view. So we're going to add the index view. We don't want to use this layout page here. You may have already cleared that out, but make sure you do. But we do want to have the box checked. All right, so we're going to add that view. I'm going to change this to be contact. This should probably be sports store. Contact us. Contact us. I want to have a form there. So at using HTML.begin form. Same stuff we're used to. So div HTML label for, oh, I'm missing something. Missing a model. So let's fix that real quick here. So at the top of the page, sports store dot models dot contact view model. So the first field would be the full name. You'll notice it's not giving me some IntelliSense. So I may need to close this and reopen it. So go back in contact index. There, we're back in here. Okay, so I've got the label. And as we did kind of mention, I do want to use, I'm going to go ahead and use the editor for helper here for all of these. So I've got the editor for the full name. I've got HTML dot validation message for full name, and then I want this to be new class text danger. Yep, that's what's up. Okay. So some of you have already seen this with the editor for, but there's one important gotcha with editor for over like text box for, checkbox for, hidden for, in that it works differently. Okay, so editor for actually works differently than all of the other fields. Okay, so with editor for, let me go look at that method. If I can have your attention here just a minute. So let's look at the editor for overloads. So we notice they take the HTML helper object. We notice they take this expression, and then they take something called additional view data. Okay. So the way that this one's structured, the way the editor for is structured, I can't just say new at class form control. If I write it this way, which is what you kind of assume, it will not work. Okay, so let's look at what our form, I want to show you what the form looks like right now if I write it that way. Notice that it's not styled, right? Notice normally if it were actually a form control, it would have those rounded corners, right? And it would be down a row. Okay, so if I inspect it, notice that there's no class attribute on it, right? If you take a really close look on there, you'll see that there's no class attribute. Okay, so with editor for, we need to specify those HTML attributes a little bit different. So we actually have to put not another object around it and say HTML attributes is equal to, or sorry, colon.
No, it is
Or
equal.
no, that is equal. Yeah. So the outer layer is an object, and this is the additional view data. And that additional view data has a property called HTML attributes, which is, that's where I can actually put, where I would normally put HTML attributes.
So what's the value in editor for?
Huh?
What's the value in editor for versus
So-
just using text box?
Right. So for a lot of things like certain, like say you have a Boolean question mark, some of those kind of different things. And the deal is by using an editor for, it'll pick up the right control based on the attributes you have in the model. Does that make sense? So rather than let's say you change your data type, it's going to more easily jump to the right editor, switch to the right editor. So it handles that a lot better. It also, again, it'll do things like the Boolean question mark, a nullable bool, will show up as a drop-down as 3 things instead of a checkbox, versus if it's just a Boolean, it'll show up as a checkbox. So it does a good job of kind of guessing what control you need to do there. Now this is just to remind you if I was using text box 4, this would just look like that, right? So this is text box 4, that's what it looks like as editor 4, okay? So you can see there's that difference in how I pass the HTML attributes. But yeah, the biggest difference there is in terms of some of the data types that it handles. So for instance, the attributes handles. So data type attribute, we need to do editor for it to do anything with it. Also for display format, that one we also need to use editor for. Does that make sense? So if for a few of these data type, and for a few of these attributes to actually work, I need to have it to be editor for, otherwise I have to do that work myself. And sometimes that is what you want, which is part of why we spent so much time using the other ones. So I'm just going to start filling that in for the rest of the 3 fields. So we'll see email and the message. And finally, I need a submit button. And I do need to add a class to the button. btn primary. So that's going to give us a basic contact us form. Okay. As it stands right now, it won't do anything interesting, right? So it won't do anything interesting when it posts back. Okay. What I actually want to do, remember that we're kind of going over Ajax here. I want to post that form using Ajax. So what I'm gonna do, what my goal here, I want to post it with Ajax, and then I want to have it say, okay, okay, collapse the or hide all the controls in the form, assuming it goes through successfully, and show a message in its place. So let's say we say JSON here. Again, I'm not filling in the actual email logic. I'm just going to say, hey, this is successful. I might want to do something in here though to say, hey, What if they didn't fill in the full name? What if they didn't fill in the email? What if they didn't fill in the message? I might want to give some input, some output back to the user in that case. So I might say if the model state's not valid, well here, remember, because I'm saying Ajax, I'm not going to say return view, right? Because I'm going to be calling this through Ajax, I need to return some sort of JSON object. So in this case, I'm going to say return, maybe success is false. Maybe send back invalid data. So that way, if it does get sent, if it does go through and send it, try to submit it without all the fields filled out, at least I can get back to the user and tell them, hey, something's not right. Does that make sense? But the trick here is I'm telling it return JSON, I'm not telling it return view. And that's where this is different than what we might normally do. Okay. So we've got that hooked up. Let's now add in the JavaScript. Okay. So again, I want to handle the form post. So what do I need to do? I want to say when this submits, do some logic.
You have to give the form an ID.
I'm going to have to give the form ID. Okay. So how do I need, what do I need to do to give that form an ID?
You have to fill out the overload.
Huh?
Or you have to fill out the overload on the get form.
Uh-huh. So what's first? What's first?
The action name,
Okay. What's my action name?
index,
Okay. What's next?
Control it.
Okay. What's that?
Contact.
Okay. What's third? For method, which is going to be what?
Post.
Okay. Post. All right, what's next? Okay. New ID is equal to maybe contact form. So I can respond to that. So remember to put the hash sign there. This is an ID. So hash contact form. So I want to handle that event. I'm going to say when the form submits, then we want to do our logic. So function, and grab the event. Okay. So I'm listening to the submit event. What's the first thing I need to do?
Prevent the default.
Okay, prevent the default, which is going to do what?
It's gonna refresh the page.
Nope.
Oh, never mind. I don't know what I'm saying.
it keeps the form from submitting normally.
Keeps the form from submitting normally, which Evan, so keeping the form to submit from submit is going to mean it doesn't refresh the page, right? because normally it would refresh the page. So I'm actually
Oh, I thought you-
preventing it from.
I thought you meant like, what is the default?
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
the default would be submit the form, refresh the page.
Right.
Right, so I'm stopping that. I'm stopping the refresh. Okay, so what do I need to do next? What do I need to do next? My goal is to send this stuff to the server using an Ajax Post.
So you do your $.post and set the URL in that method to
Okay.
like a URL.action that refers back to the post method we made in the contact controller.
Okay. Somebody give me the name of that method. What's the name of that method? What's the name of the method? What's the name of the action method?
Index.
It's index. Okay. Look at contact controller. It's index, right? Okay. What's next? So here's what I have so far.
It needs to get the view model.
Gets the view model.
Yeah, since it accepts a contact view model as a parameter.
Okay. So what's it? What do you mean by it? Something needs to get the contact view model, but what?
Yeah, the post method.
Of. Huh? The controller. Yeah. So the controller needs to get the view model. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, so the controller needs to get the view model. I need to get it there somehow, right? I definitely don't want to send it via rote values because, again, the user's going to type in the values after I render the page. So at some point here, I need to say, curly brace, send those values. Okay? Where are those values that I need to send to the server?
The values in the editor. So,
Okay.
oh shoot.
I haven't loaded them yet, have I?
No. So you need to create JavaScript variables for them, maybe?
Probably need to. Okay, so somebody else give me a line of code that I need to write here. Let's start by loading the full name. How can I get the full name? Ben. Essen. Huh?
With a constant?
Okay, so it's going to be a const. Okay, next.
Full name?
Okay, so let's call it full name equals something. Brandon? Scott?
Some sort of value.
Value? Okay, $sign and then the ID. Okay, so like full name.
So like parentheses, quote, and then whatever the ID is.
Okay. All right, so first parentheses, quote. I've got parentheses and quotes. Yep. So I need a pound at the beginning. All right, so that's got me the full name, right? I'm all good?
Say it again.
Dot val, okay.
Louder.
Right, because otherwise I'm just getting the control. Okay, so I've got the full name there, and that's how I can write that out. Probably the same thing for all the other three, right? So I'm going to go ahead and fill those in. Email, $. I would recommend taking rather than copy and pasting those 3 lines, take the time to write them all out by hand, just because you want that practice of remembering all the pieces that goes into it. So we've loaded the values, I've sent them to the server, and I'm done, right?
Have you actually set those IDs?
How could I find out?
You can scroll up and look. I don't think you
What's another way I can find out?
Can you load the page and inspect?
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So let me inspect it. Where's my developer tools? There they are. So if we look at here, what's the ID? Is there an ID set?
Oh,
There is an ID. There's an ID and a name. They're both full name. How did it get that? Where did that come from?
is that what Editor 4 does? Does Editor 4 do that?
Editor 4 does do that. Textbox 4 also does that.
When we bind, using that little lambda expression, when we bind it to one of the properties in the model,
Yes.
I'm assuming that HTML helper is automatically setting the ID to that.
Exactly.
name.
So there's basically 3 things that are happening. And this happens whether I'm using Textbox 4, Hidden 4, Editor 4. This Lambda does a lot of things for us. So there's 3 things that it's doing, right? So the first thing is it's setting the ID. So it's going to set the ID equal to whatever we have there, so ID full name. It's going to set the name to full name as well. And it's also going to set the value based on what's in the model. So all 3 of those HTML attributes are set simply by putting that lambda in there. Does that make sense? So the ID is one we use in JavaScript to work with it. The name is what's actually sent to this, is used to send it to the server. So that's what we need for the post back. And the value is the value that's currently in there. That makes sense? So all 3 of those things are set by that lambda. And that's a very good thing to remember.
Now's a good time for a break.
Now, yeah, probably. Yes.
So I just had a question. So the index post method in our controller is taking that contact view model and we're sending in full name, email, and message.
Yep.
I'm like confused how that's interpreted, because what I was thinking is that we'd have to make like a const model as like an object containing the full name, email, and message in JavaScript, and send that.
Well, remember the curly braces.
Right.
This is kind of like JSON. I'm creating an object right here. Those curly braces are already creating an object.
Okay. And that object that's called data, right? Is that what that is? Or is
That's the parameters that are being sent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. What you call it, it could be data, it could be params. It depends on where you look. I think here they call it, I don't want to rely on that, but it says suggest data here, but I don't rely on that. But either way, those are the parameters that we're sending to the server.
So it's already creating an object, you don't have to do it manually?
Right. Well, no, we're creating the object here.
Right.
That's it. with what you were suggesting, we take that object, save it in another variable, and then pass the variable.
Right.
Right? Because I could say like const params is equal to that is equal to that exactly.
Right.
It's the same thing, right? There's no difference,
Uh-huh.
right? Params is just a name for this.
Mm-hmm. See, I understand like the whole passing data as like parameters with the request or with the post request or whatever. But when we're calling that index method,
Yeah.
we're still missing that contact view model parameter, and that's where I'm kind of.
But we're not. We're not missing it. Okay. So I'm building up an object here, right? That object has 3 properties, right?
Mm-hmm.
Full name, email, and message.
Right.
Okay, let's look at our contact view model. It's an object.
Yeah.
It has 3 parameters: full name, email, and message.
So we could send anything there, and there'd be like no way to check to make sure it's valid data. Is like so like.
Right. I could send anything to the server here.
Yeah. Okay.
I could send anything to the server there.
Okay.
The server checks it when it gets it right here.
Oh, duh. Okay.
Right? As soon as the server gets it, it's saying, is the model valid?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it takes that object that we built in JavaScript and is going to dynamically turn that into this view model object.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it's always been doing that. It's always been doing that. Even when we've been doing it normally with posting, it's been taking the way that it's sent and turning it into these view models. In fact, it will even take things like if you put it in as a query parameter, like question user equals foo, that can even go, those things can even get turned into a view model. So
Okay.
any way we send data, that's one of the big strengths of using MVC, is it will bind that data to our view model just by looking at the names. So it can come in through form parameters, it can come in through the URL, or it can come in like we're doing here as a JSON object.
Wow. Yeah,
And
I didn't know how that
all 3 of those ways will get turned into that view model.
Okay.
Okay, so let's take a break and let's come back at 3:50.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, MVC is like interpreting that and kind of, yeah, exactly what you said. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, same actually. Sure.
That kind of thing.
Right here. That's the code you want to see the change, right? So if I hit, okay, it's getting it.
Yes.
So let's step over. So the photo ID 1. Built out the URL, and that URL is correct. Oh, I'm going to guess. No, I'm not. I'm wrong. Oh no, I see it. Yeah, you're reading the attribute. You're not setting the attribute.
Okay.
So if you don't pass the second parameter, which is what you want to set it to, it reads it. specify your parameters so you can say.
Oh. Okay.
Remember, so in jQuery that without the second part is a read. So where turns the source,
Right.
you want to set the
Changes.
source.
Okay.
Yeah. That's all.
Okay. Cool.
You're just reading it instead of setting.
Oh, so that information I had to get from the job fair.
Yep.
Do I just,
Write it out on paper, that's fine.
so like write it on the back of the updated resume?
That way I would take.
Okay. In that case, I need to print out a new copy.
Okay. If you want other paper, I can give you that instead, but yeah.
For Regis, would they be considered consulting too?
No, they're much more focused.
I know they.
Have you noticed?
I mean, I know what they do, but I just was thinking like they work with lots of different. I know it's like all like more like police kind of stuff.
Okay, or more generally government,
Okay.
right? All of their contracts are pretty much government contracts. So law enforcement and things like that. So does that make sense? They have a more focused client than like worldwide technology, which is pretty much anybody can do what they can learn. Right, they have a more focused what kind of clients they try to work with, and if you talk to them as well, you'll find that they have a lot of military, law enforcement people in there.
Did you get a chance, Mr. Smith?
Yeah.
Got a quick, it's an error I haven't seen. I looked online, there's a couple things I might be able to do.
No. Column section has not been defined in your admin layout.
You didn't have the render.
Bless you, thank you.
At the end of all this, you need to say render.
Naturally.
I thought it was maybe putting it in there. So what it means is that in your view, you've defined that section, but your layout's not defined where to render that. Other than not include a symbol.
Okay. So at the
So
end.
render section, what's the name of the section?
Scripts.
Scripts, yeah. So scripts, and then comma, what? Required is.
True. Or
I can do it.
Default.
AWS
Um,
has this like celebrity face database.
It's true.
Required false.
Required false.
Saying that?
What is
It
required?
could be like a Snapchat
Required
filter.
means you have to have that
I
section.
can't.
Yeah.
You like literally, literally take a picture of yourself,
Okay.
send it to this AWS system, have them return.
That's generally the case with most.
Yeah, pretty much any section.
We have this
you're
thing
gonna
called
make it
recognition.
optional.
And you can do it like, you can do it with like an existing.
The section should be optional.
and stuff. But they also have one that's like full of like millions of images of celebrities. And you can literally, just for fun, I kind of make like just like a celebrity lookalike app. just
Okay.
screw with it.
So where we left off, we were talking about how this data gets transmitted. So remember, we're passing these parameters here, and that's building up an object, and that object is then on the server side being turned back into a view model, right? So you don't see this class contact view model anywhere in the JavaScript, but it will magically be turned back into that. Okay. So on the side of this index page still, on that JavaScript, are we done? Is there anything left that we need to do?
I don't believe those are the same names as the ones in the view model, so you need to use the colons.
No, they're actually okay. They're actually okay. Let's take a close look at them. And I can prove this real easy. If I stick a breakpoint here, right? Stick breakpoint there. Let's run with the debugger attached. What you'll see is all the values that I enter are going to be there. You are catching on something that you are catching on something correctly, but it actually is still going to work. So let's look at this model. You see what's there? There's my email, there's my full name, there's my message. So what are you seeing that made you think that we needed colons?
I knew that JavaScript and C# were case-sensitive languages.
Yes, they are. The languages are case-sensitive, yes. So are you saying that these have a different case than the properties in my view model?
Yeah, they do.
Right? So those variables, I've got them all as lowercase. They're camel case, but they're starting with a lowercase letter. Okay? Whereas the properties start with an uppercase letter. So remember what I called that process that we go from here over to the C# cog side? What did I call that process? Taking this into that view model.
Is it binding?
Model binding, right? So there's a model binding process that happens in there. In the model binding process, it is case insensitive. In the model binding process, it is case insensitive. So even though these are being sent to the server in a different case, then the model, C# is going to recognize that and just, okay, well, it's the same. It's going to just ignore the case. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So in the model binding, it is case insensitive, even though in either language, both JavaScript and C#, it is case sensitive. The model binding is case insensitive. So if I did want to have them be the same case, I would have to say potentially full name, colon, full name like that. If I needed to change the case, right? So if I was working with some other technology, some other backend, maybe I would need to do that. But the way that the model binding works here, it doesn't actually matter. Okay. So I've posted it. Does that mean I'm done? Because let's look at the current user experience for the user. So I've posted this. I can click this a bunch of times, and nothing seems to happen.
On mine, I got a success true message.
How did you get a success true message?
So similar to what I did on the admin layout, I did it to layout, which was the render.
But let's just look at your view, okay?
Section.
Let's look at your view.
Oh,
According to my code up here, am I doing anything with the once it sends the message? Once it posts the message, I'm not doing anything with it. So I need to do something with it, right? What method do I need to call to do something with the result?
Done.
And you call done. Okay, so let's call done. Okay, I also want to make sure I call fail. So in the done case, I'm going to say function and get the data. In the fail case, I'm going to get function XHR text status error thrown. And maybe here I want to alert text status. So here I'm going to show an alert. And here on this side, I want to handle that data, right? What's up, Scott?
I put something in the wrong section.
Okay. Okay. So one thing I know, remember from this controller, if the data's not valid, I'm going to get here, I'm going to say success is false. Versus if it's true, if it's successful, I'm going to get down here to success is true, right? So one thing I may want to do, I want to check that that field is actually set, that it is actually successful. So I'm going to say if data and data.success. Now, one gotcha with dealing with Booleans. So remember, in JavaScript, it's not a type-sensitive language. There's a lot of automatic conversions that happens. Remember that there's this thing called falsy and truthy. In this case, I want to know for sure that that success property is actually true, not just some other value, right? I want to know it is exactly true. So rather than just saying data.success, I'm going to compare it with true with a triple bar. Okay? So refresher, if I say equals equals versus triple equals, okay, what's the difference between these two in as far as JavaScript is concerned? Because both of these operators exist.
Double equals sign, I think, only compares value, while triple also compares data types.
Okay, that's a good way to explain it. The other way I can explain it is I can say value, we can say value and data type are equal. This one compares both the value and the data type. Well, this one says compares the value after conversion. So if I just do a single double equals, it will convert the two things, the two objects on both sides to the same data type and then compare their values. That make sense?
Yeah.
It'll convert them and then compare them.
Just kind of want to say an example of the double and not being so reliable is that the integer 0 and an empty array will see them as the same thing with double equal sign.
Well, empty array is special.
Yeah.
Empty array is special. Everything else works sensically, but empty array is special. I don't want to get into that one. But basically, if I say 1 equals true, this statement right here, is that true or false? Huh? So this is going to be true because they're both going to get converted to integers. The true gets converted to an integer, and now 1 equals 1. So this is going to give us a true. Versus if I say 1 triple equals true, this is false. Because here they're both getting converted integers. Here it just says, oh, they're different data types, I'm not going to do the conversion. It's false. Does that make sense? So that's why when I'm doing things like this, I'm making sure that success is true. I want to make exactly sure that it's actually true and not just something that can be converted to true. Does that make sense? You can see why I'm doing that? I want to be safe.
So like if success somehow was returned as 1 instead of true.
Yeah, or if it was returned as a string, then it would also potentially be true. Right? So for instance,
what if you
yep.
or put it in parentheses again, like data and data success in parentheses, and then put a not in front of it?
What do you mean? You said what?
If you put it in parentheses, data and data.success in parentheses, put a not in front of it, and then set it equal to true, or no, that wouldn't.
No, it wouldn't help because it's the problem with the data types.
No. I was just seeing if you're trying to find an equivalent.
So for instance, this here, the string true equals the string true, equals true. This is actually true. Because this gets converted to the string true. So if you have strings on either side, a string on either side, then they both get converted to strings.
And if it was 3 equals, it would be
3 equals, that would be false, because the data types are different. So that's where that triple bar can be very helpful, especially because we're translating from the C# world to the JavaScript world. There's a lot that could accidentally go wrong. So that just makes sure that it actually was sent. So I'm going to say if it was sent, then we can actually show that we can do some stuff, tell the user that it was successful. If it wasn't successful, I'll show the message that came back. So there it would say like invalid data. Yep.
Whenever I hover over it, it has a message in brackets and then a question mark, colon, and then it says any. Is that kind of the same thing?
The reason is that it doesn't know what type data is. See, data any? It doesn't know what type data is. It's trying to kind of give you some suggestions based on what it knows about the data types, but because it's coming back from this Ajax request, it's got no idea what data is, because it could actually be anything. Okay, so if it's successful, what I want to do is I want to show a message on the page that says, okay, yes, your message was sent, thank you, and then collapse the form. I'm actually going to animate it closed, right? So let's start with this. So I want to display that message first. How can I put that message onto the screen? How can I put a message onto the screen that says, hey, yes, we got it?
You could use a modal.
I could use a modal. Okay. What if I want to do it and just say, basically I'm going to replace this dialog. What if I say I want to put it here at the end, underneath the form?
You just put it in div?
I can put in a div. Okay, so how would I do that?
Yeah, Bootstrap has a alert div class.
They do have an alert class, yeah. My question is, where's that div coming from? Am I creating that div out of thin air? Or do I need to already have that there to begin with?
Probably be easier if you already had it.
Okay. It could be. I'm actually going to go the other route. So let's create it out of thin air. So I'm going to say, go to the contact form. And if I say go up to the parent, and then append. So remember, the parent is what contains the contact form. And then if I add something to that, that'll be after the contact form. It'll be at the end of that. There. So I'm going to say append. As far as what I append, that's going to be my message. So I might say div. Fair forewarning, I am using single quotes here intentionally. I am using single quotes here intentionally because if I don't, I may run into a little bit of a problem. So don't use double quotes here because I'm going to put double quotes inside of it. So if we say alert, alert success, thank you. That should get you a little message after the form that says thank you. So the user gets some sort of indication that it went through. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay.
Yesterday we did a pen or data map.
We did a map, right? Because we were mapping this array to this array of divs. Remember? So here I'm just trying to show a single div that I've just hard-coded. So there I don't need to do any sort of map. The map had to do with the array that we were turning from one thing to another. And then finally, I want this contact form to animate away. So if I say slide up, that should get rid of it. So that should look like when you successfully get it, when you get the message sent, it should show that message and then collapse. Did you get that? Did you test it, Paxton? Did you set an ID on the form? In the contact form. Okay. So go over to your browser, the developer tools one, and just see if you can step through the breakpoints and see if you can figure it out.
sort of syntax error. Okay, so because it looks like you.
Well, I haven't had a chance to go over it.
You have, oh, your problem with jQuery? This needs to be HTTPS. This here needs to be HTTPS. So it's actually not loading. It's not actually loading the code in jQuery.
Oh, there it goes. Okay. Yeah, it was just a build error. Is yours not even posted? Okay, so it's gotta be on the
It's saying I can't find the knowledge.
Yeah. Here, data is undefined. You have to put data as a primary here. In this callback function.
Oh, I'm supposed to get a thank you down
Here, right. Yeah. Rebuild it. That's what I did. Well, I did, and it gave me, when I would submit it, it gave me an alert saying undefined. Because the data was invalid, because it's that checker.
So go back and
checker the data.
Hit that file, go
Did
into
you,
your Java.
did you build the contact controller yet?
Oh, no, I guess I have to.
Okay, so that was right.
So you're still getting that.
Hit F11 so you get back
Oh,
out.
that's weird. I know. So you're getting an error. So it's going to this alert. So this is not. So the data and data success is returning false.
I just put a little large on that.
Right. Well, it's going straight to this. Oh, maybe it could be this. It could just be a fifth here. Yeah. So we know. Okay, so it's happening here. Okay, so it's not letting us data.
Yeah, right. But I'm not going to do that here.
Yeah, I was going to say, check that.
So it's the same.
No, not control it. Control.
It's, you just drop that code on the back end. That's right. You've got one of these already. It's, if you understand what you've done here, previously, it's just, you can previously just.
Go back to your view.
Maybe the form then?
No, it doesn't. He doesn't matter. No, because that's
Your problem's going to be
right.
on the JavaScript side.
That's what you want there.
So where I would start, put the breakpoint on just the first line of your script. Or the first. You gotta figure out where is it happening. Or you could also put in a breakpoint there, put a
Yeah, that looks
breakpoint on
fine.
that. Why don't you refresh the page? Because it should immediately get rid of this page.
Browser.
No, it's being weird because it's saying what is the alert coming back saying? Oh, okay. Mine said undefined.
So.
Yeah, it's submitting, but the data is.
It's not gonna break point.
So you got. So that means that.
Yeah, because you have a breakpoint.
But that's weird because the validation on the form should tell you if it's invalidated initially, right? That's weird. Right, exactly.
That's why it's taking so long to refresh. So, remember what I got? Sit here, get run without deliver.
put a break. No. Well, yeah, there.
So close that tab and just open. You can go back to the previous one here. So hit go.
Should go to.
So you can see if it refreshes the page, it gets here.
Full name is null.
Okay, so it's not saving the full name properly.
Yeah, so back to your view.
Wait, could be an issue with the parameters that you
Yeah. Lowercase.
See here, two step of
Yep.
and you hit step over, which is the second button.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. Frustrating.
You wanted to do step over. That was the second button.
You have to read it.
But it looks like it.
I wonder if there is a refresh.
That could have done it.
Alert. Yeah. Alert.
Alert.
You should have rebuilt it. I don't know why the alert's not.
Sweet.
Feel like proper. I'm not gonna use it right now. Come on, but put an email in. Copy. No, just the style and the dial. Yeah, check the inspect that. It's not getting.
Found you.
Well, it's weird because it's getting an alert success class, but it's not getting. Oh, reset your cache. Reset your cache.
Oh, so hard refresh.
Yeah, control F. Yeah, control F.
And then there's
Come on.
but like I imagine, I think what you're getting is fine. You're really serious.
I don't know why you're.
It's nothing to do with this car.
You're expecting like
From this
different.
car.
Well,
Okay.
the style.
Found this car.
It's not getting, it's not getting the sound from the alert class.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. If you never hit which
Let's hit save all.
Where was that?
Let's make sure you're on the
First of all, right, this book.
Yeah, because there's so many people.
You just didn't have it saved, you button. Making us go through resetting. Come on, man.
So we kind of see now that we put in that, right? If we traditionally, if we hey, can I get your attention? So you can see, you know, we already had these contact forms. We already had these forms. You could submit it, and it would go. It would refresh the whole page, right? But now that we've changed this to use Ajax, and it's not refreshing the whole page. Now it opens it up so we can do animations with things. See that? So we can make the user interface a lot nicer. Where it just, oh, okay, you want to collapse it? Great, I can do that. I can't do those things if I have the page refresh happen. So it enables us to do a lot of cool animations now that we're working with JavaScript instead of having the page refresh. So that's all I want to go over today. That should give you enough to get started with your labs. One important thing. One important thing to kind of put this in perspective as well. So we built these web services now. Recognize like these web services, these action methods that return JSON. Those we can use in more things than just a website. Okay. In fact, these web services that we've written, we can now actually hook those up into desktop applications, into mobile apps, whether it be an Android device or whether it be an iPhone device. All of this stuff that we've done here now on the back end can be connected into another app, right? If we're just working in the HTML world, well, that only works for a website.
But if I'm building these services that return JSON, I can now integrate that into any app I want. Yes, please. Yep.
On the job fair thing, is it okay if I print that off and bring it to you?